So we're in Jerusalem. It's 597 BC, and we're with the prophet Jeremiah. Now, 597 BC in Jerusalem is a tough place to be. Jeremiah is living in a city that's surrounded by a foreign army. The Babylonian army is besieging Jerusalem, and there's little hope of success in defending the city. The city indeed will be attacked, it will be breached, it will be burned. Not only that, but Jeremiah is imprisoned. The king, Zedekiah, has not liked all the preaching that Jeremiah has been doing, because Jeremiah has been preaching doom and gloom. We're in chapter 32 here, and our first reading this morning from the Hebrew Bible. Chapters 1 through 31 were pretty much just Jeremiah preaching doom and gloom, preaching that a catastrophe was on the way, prophesying God's warning to the Judeans. You all are on the wrong path. Your leaders are on the wrong path. You haven't been faithful to Torah, to the law, to the way of life that you're supposed to be engaging in. And for that reason, things are falling apart for you. For that reason, a catastrophe is coming. Well, Jeremiah was right. The catastrophe is here, and Jeremiah is stuck with all the doom and gloom that he himself had been preaching. Jerusalem in 597 BC is not a great place to be, but that's where Jeremiah is. In a besieged city, himself imprisoned by his own king. And it's in this moment, with the imminent defeat of his people, and we know what Jeremiah, I think, also basically knew, although the king and others may have denied it. We know that soon the leaders will be taken into exile in Babylon, and Jeremiah presumably with them. It's this moment that God chooses to come to Jeremiah with a very different message. 31 chapters of doom and gloom, but now we get this strange command, this strange call. God comes to Jeremiah and says, go and buy a house. Go buy a house. Now, the middle of a siege that you're going to lose seems to be about the worst time to invest in real estate, right? Property values are about to plummet. Most of the structures in Jerusalem will burn to the ground, and whatever is left is going to be taken over by the occupying army. This is the worst moment to buy a home in Jerusalem. No realtor would tell you to buy now, but God says, buy now. Go and buy a home. Now, the call to buy a home isn't really about real estate, of course. This is a message for Jeremiah, but Jeremiah's action, and he is faithful. I'm not sure he quite understands at first, but he goes and he buys this home. Jeremiah's action is itself a message, right? It's a message to Jeremiah, but it's a message to his people. God is saying, yes, things are bad now. All that doom and gloom that I've been trying to warn you about for the last few decades, it has arrived, and nothing's going to change that. But it won't always be so bad. A time will come when you can rebuild. A time will come when those who are taken into exile, or at least their descendants, will be able to return. Notice the way our passage ends today. It's on page 6 in our bulletin. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall again be bought in this land. Things are bad, and they're going to stay bad for a long time, God says, but they won't be bad forever. Now, indeed, eventually those exiled to Babylon would return, or really not them. The exile lasted probably for about 50 or 60 years, but their children, or perhaps their grand or great-grandchildren, they would return, and they would rebuild, as we learn about in the books of the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah. This promise was fulfilled. There was a long delay for that hope to actually arrive, or for the fruit of that hope to actually arrive. but it was coming. Jeremiah lived in a time of doom and gloom, and the doom and gloom was real, and it would last for a while, but not forever. That's the message that we get. In this order to buy a home, there's a message of hope, ultimately, in the long term. Now, as we stand today in Washington, D.C. in 2022, things don't look as bad as Jerusalem in 597. There's no foreign army surrounding this city. But I still think in many ways we live in a time of doom and gloom, right? We have a lot of problems, a lot of anxieties, a lot of worries on our minds. If we look at the worldwide stage, we see, for example, that the threat of climate change only increases, and our leaders seem to be doing precious little about it. Many of us also cast an anxious eye towards Ukraine, not only worried about the Ukrainian people, but concerned about the possibility that the war there might expand beyond the borders of that country. It's a lot to be worried about. And if we focus our attention on the national scale rather than the international, there's plenty of things to be worried about here at home too, aren't there? In the last 10 years, we've seen a resurgence of racism and xenophobia in this country. Income inequality, poverty is getting worse, not better. In fact, lifespans in this country are actually decreasing. We don't have a foreign army surrounding our capital, but the threat of authoritarian politics and even authoritarian violence lingers around us, doesn't it? With the attack on the Capitol last January, a stark reminder of that threat. There's a lot to be worried about. There's a lot of doom and gloom in the air in 2022. And if we move from the national focus down to the personal, each of us has our own crosses to bear, don't we? Many of us face illness, or we have friends or family who are sick or injured. Many of us face clinical levels of anxiety and depression. A lot of us deal with dysfunctional relationships, dysfunctional family relationships, dysfunctional romantic relationships. Perhaps most common of all, many of us deal with dysfunctional workplace relationships, working in jobs where we're overworked and underpaid, and we don't see a way forward. So from top to bottom, from the largest scale to the smaller scale, there's a lot of doom and gloom in 2022. Now, you've heard me most weeks stand here and give some version of the following message, right? Most weeks I stand here and no matter what the passage is, I say some version of this. I say, look, genuine faith in God, genuine discipleship to Jesus Christ means taking action, right? Faith has to manifest in action. God is at work in this world trying to heal what is wounded, trying to repair what is broken. And if we claim to have faith in that God, we need to do the work God calls us to. Take action to make the world better. And that's true, and I stand by it. And yet, perhaps some Sundays, as you've heard me preach, you've wondered if there really is action that you can take to solve all the problems you see. The truth is, we know that oftentimes we face problems that are certainly far bigger than any individual can deal with. The threat of war in Ukraine expanding, or the threat of climate change is obviously a set of problems much larger than I can deal with. And even as we try to gather collective action to face these problems, we find that our political system seems unable to actually effectively respond, almost like it was designed that way. Even if we focus at the personal level, though, we know that if we face illness or our friends and family face illness, we can take some action, we can help out, we can give them a call or bring them some food, give them a ride, we can certainly pray for them. And we should do all these things, of course. But we know that none of those actions is going to guarantee that they'll be healed, that they'll be better. We face problems often in life where there isn't a clear path of action to fix them. And so the question we might find ourselves asking is, what then? What are we supposed to do then? What does genuine faith look like if we don't have a clear way of fixing the problems that we feel God is calling us to address? And I think that this passage, this call to Jeremiah to buy the house, is for us too, right? God doesn't promise Jeremiah that things won't be bad. Indeed, things are going to get really bad. People are going to die. People are going to be dragged into exile. Families will be destroyed. Homes will be destroyed. The great temple in Jerusalem, the pride of the Judean people, will be burned to the ground. Things are bad. God simply promises that they won't remain bad forever, that eventually things will get better, that this too shall pass. And so the work that Jeremiah is called to do here in chapter 32 is not to somehow fix the problems that he faces. The action he's called to take is to simply maintain hope in the face of the tragedy that he's caught in. The call to buy the home is a call to announce hope. And Jeremiah's willingness to pay for a home in the middle of a siege is a profound act of faith and hope. As I already suggested, it's important to note that Jeremiah himself almost certainly never lived in that home, may have never stepped a foot in that home that he bought. Perhaps his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren were able to return from exile and live there. He took an action that had nothing to do with improving his life. It was an act of hope, hoping that his descendants might have a better life. Jeremiah's task wasn't to somehow take up a sword and drive the Babylonians away. The battle was lost. His job was to keep hope alive, to cultivate hope within himself, and then to pass it on to others, both those in the city with him, but perhaps even more importantly for those coming after him, his biological descendants and his spiritual descendants as well. We sometimes imagine hope as a flame, right? We talk about hope burning bright or being pushed back, maybe even extinguished. In this moment, Jerusalem, 597 BC, that flame of hope is flickering and dying down. It's only burning in a few hearts in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah's job is to not let it go out, to guard that flame, and to find opportunities to let it pass on and burn in others. That's it. That's the job. There's no fixing the problems. There's no avoiding the doom and gloom. The job is to not give up. And this is not the first or the last time where the human task of faith was simply to maintain hope in the face of extraordinary tragedy. Imagine being a European peasant in the 1400s as the bubonic plague spread across Europe, killing a huge number of people. More than a third of the population. In some places, more than 2/3 of the population died very quickly of a terrible disease. These peasants had no tools, no doctors to go to, no antibiotics, and they had a political system that did not care about them. It was a terrible time to be alive. Their job was to just not give up, to believe that at some point in the future, their descendants could have a better life, even though they were not going to have a better life. Or I imagine an enslaved person living here in the 1750s in North America. We know, with hindsight, and I'm sure they could see too, that the chances for them to achieve liberation were vanishingly small. Only a tiny number of people were able to escape slavery at that time. And again, we know that it would be more than a century before full liberation would actually come. Those people would die enslaved, and the vast majority of their children would die enslaved. And I think most of them recognized that they didn't have the tools to win that fight. Some of them did, and they escaped or they helped others escape. Whenever they could, they took that action. But when they couldn't, they kept that hope alive. They didn't give up in the face of their oppression and exploitation. That was the job more often than not, to guard that hope, to cultivate that hope, and to pass that hope along to future generations that would receive the fruit of that hope. So I stand by my common message that genuine faith means genuine action in the present, not waiting, doing what we're called to do now, struggling for a better world now. But this passage reminds me, and it forces me to accept the fact that sometimes the only action we can take is to persevere, to hold on to hope, and perhaps most importantly, to create a space for others, especially those younger than us, to receive that hope and live it, trusting and believing that they may have an opportunity to struggle for a better world, even when we feel like all we're doing is treading water. Sometimes faith is just about keeping hope alive. The word that comes to Jeremiah is for him, but it's also for us. Go and buy a home here. I don't think this means we all need to go invest in real estate, and living in DC, few of us really can. But I think God is telling us, invest yourself in this place. When things look worse, when you feel like things are getting even worse, that's not a time to cut and run. It's a time to invest yourself in this place. Find a way to persevere and to help others persevere, because a better and a different day is coming and is possible, even if it doesn't seem that way right now. Our spiritual work often involves taking action, and at other times, the only action that we can take is to just guard and cultivate that hope. So I hope that here at St. Augustine's, we'll continue to build a community that takes action to make things better. I also hope, though, that we'll build a community we can come to for refuge and for solace when it's clear that things aren't getting better quickly enough. We need to be a community of action and a community of perseverance, a community that guards its hope and can grow hope in others. I pray that we'll continue this work. My friends, may it be so. Amen.